Karen is an associate professor at Berkeley in their School of City and Regional Planning. She's also the associate director of the Institute for Urban and Regional Development and is the faculty director of the Center for Community Innovation. And I have to say that she really represents a combination of both scholarly excellence as well as in-the-field practical applications. And so has had an opportunity to see social innovation, social interactions from multiple perspectives. And it's my hope that, and my expectation that her perspectives will help inform ours and make our conversation much richer. So please join me in welcoming
Okay, thank you, Raphael, and thank you all for coming. I see the free lunch incentive. It's universal. It works everywhere. Very effective. I'm really flattered to be invited here to talk about this topic, which I started thinking about 10 years ago, and then I got so busy kind of trying to innovate on the ground, I forgot to think about it again, really, until this last month. So this is a great opportunity for me to kind of revisit thinking in this area of social innovation. I have to say, excuse me, as I drop my talk on the ground, that I came here once before to give a talk, and one of the things that impressed me about you guys was that you were very interactive, that you never let me finish a sentence. And maybe that's because there's a lot of economists here, and that's sort of the tradition. And so I'm fully expecting that today. And so I only have something like 14 PowerPoint slides, and I'm expecting that we can interact on an ongoing basis here. So, and that to me is a joy too. So in preparation for this talk, Richard and Raphael sent me a list of questions. And have you all seen these questions? Like, what is the meaning of life? They were really hard questions. And so I may or may not be able to address any of them. I think I actually incorporate parts of most of them into this talk. But I think they're the right questions, and I think this is a really great opportunity for USC to be asking these types of questions. It's a great time to do it. This is a great place to do it. And I think from what I've seen, the Price Family Charities is a very, very interesting partner to be working with in this whole investigation. So I'm going to talk today about some models of community development, of what you might call sustainable community development, and so the success stories that we've seen. And this is not a scientifically chosen sample. It's some models that occurred to me as I thought about City Heights, and I thought about your all's talents at USC, and thought about what has sort of risen to the surface in the field of community development. I'll talk briefly about the issues of scale and sustainability, not again with the answers, but with some interesting learning that I've done in that area. Then I'm going to move to the academic level for a moment and talk about how can we, thinking about building a theory of social innovation. And then I want to talk a little bit about impact, because I think this is what it comes down to for this center and for you guys, is thinking about how you can best leverage it to make an impact in the community and in the field in general, and also the rest of the world. So let's go back to 1967. This is not a picture of 1967. This is a very recent picture of an event in Bedford-Stuyvesant. But I bring it up because this is the Restoration Plaza building. So Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation is often thought of as sort of the start of community development. It's probably the first, it calls itself the first CDC, the first Community Development Corporation. And what it ended up having a disproportionate impact on the field because of its friend, Robert Kennedy, who came and took a walk around Bed-Stuy and said, okay, I put forth an Economic Opportunity Act in 1964. Now I'm going to offer some amendments, and I'm going to really think about how to push this forward, how to come up with, how to leverage all these things that we're doing in our administration, the model cities, war on poverty, et cetera. How can we leverage all of that into creating a national model for community development? So this is thought of as the onset of the CDC movement, and it's often not realized that this was a really comprehensive community building effort. So after this, in the subsequent decades, we saw some 3,000 CDCs come into being. Many of them were really exclusively focused on housing, and that sort of followed the trends of the time and the funding that was available at the time. But the Bedford-Stuy model was actually much more about comprehensive community building. It was about financial capital and human capital. Probably their biggest success was leveraging the CETA program for job training and for summer jobs. There was economic development, not a great success. There was a ton of housing, and a lot of it leveraged with HUD money and project-based Section 8 money. And Bed-Stuy Restoration was, for a time, the second largest owner of real estate in Brooklyn after the city of New York. So they had a lot of property there. They were doing a lot of work. And this is the sort of fabric they were working with. And it's really important to understand the impacts that they have had in the area. And somebody attempted to do that and actually wrote a book that has a chapter on this. David Rusk wrote a book called Inside Game, Outside Game. And David Rusk came back, just like Robert Kennedy, he took a walk through Bed-Stuy. And this was around 1995 or 1998. He took a walk around and he said, wait a second, there's a lot of poor people here in the neighborhood still. I don't think this has made any difference. And he looked at the census data, and actually all he had was 1980 census data. But he basically said, this whole model of the inside game, this whole model of community development is bankrupt, and we need to think regionally, and we need to think about what we can do to help people get out of these types of places instead of investing in the bricks and mortar kinds of things. So his assessment was that this hadn't had an impact. And yet there's a couple reasons to question that. And one reason is what happened with property values. So this is Zillow. These are current property values in this area. You can pick up a 3-story brownstone for somewhere between $600,000 and $800,000 now. Now, Rusk, when he thought about the impacts here, he didn't have Zillow. And actually, what's interesting is that most of this escalation in property values happened after the census data he was looking at. It happened in the 90s and happened in more recent years. So arguably, this has had an impact. It's had certainly an impact on the finances of the area, whether it's directly attributable to this one CDC is unknown, but the area has transformed in some way.
So
yeah.
there's the first root economist.
Yes, I was waiting for
property
it.
values in New York in the 90s in general rose very dramatically.
Yeah.
And compared to Manhattan and other parts of Brooklyn, those prices aren't that high. If you go to Park Slope or Brooklyn Heights,
Yeah.
I bet you have double the price per square foot
Yeah.
that you have there. So it's
Yeah.
just a New York real estate phenomenon as opposed to something that happened because of this corporation.
Right. Well, this is a strong market, and this is an area that it's probably seen more appreciation because it was undervalued, right? So a lot of people were able to realize the rent gap and make money in the area. What's interesting is that despite all this going on and this sort of influx of newcomers that it has happened in the area, there's a fair amount of property turnover, is you still have the people there. And the reason you have the people there is you have some of the strongest rent control laws in the country, and you have a very, very large inventory of subsidized housing in the area that's made it possible for people to stay and benefit as the area has improved around them and there's been more amenities. Yeah.
I don't know where you're going, so I'm reluctant.
Okay.
But
Go
my
ahead.
response to Rusk is he's completely wrong. That if the poor people are there and the place has gotten better, that's success, not failure. We don't want to change the model. We want to take that model and make that the model for everywhere else.
Right. Well, and then, so there's a question of why Russ came to this conclusion. And part of it is that markets take longer to evolve. Community development solutions take a long, long time to settle in. And we shouldn't jump to conclusions. But then I think also the outcomes are very, very complicated. And there's been a number of different efforts by foundations in particular to do this and to do it on a comprehensive scale and to call it sustainable community development. And one of the most interesting efforts is by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the Family Economic Success Making Connections Project. And that is an interesting effort because they actually took the time to look at who was benefiting from these types of gains. And they actually followed the residents over a number of years and tried to figure out, and Urban Institute was their data partner and did some really interesting analysis of the data. And one of the things that they found was that if you just measured success at looking at the people who stayed in the area, you didn't necessarily have positive outcomes from all their interventions. It turned out the ones who were benefiting most from their interventions had left. Those were the ones that were able to take advantage of all the educational initiatives and all the career initiatives and so forth. And they had done well, and they'd left the neighborhood to find better housing elsewhere. And so it raises real questions about how we think about all these outcomes. Yeah.
So I guess a more basic question is,
Yeah.
do CPCs have clearly defined outcomes they're trying to reach? And what are those outcomes? So improving property
Yeah.
values would be one outcome.
Yeah.
Improving the educational attainment or the incomes or the job prospects of residents would be a different set of outcomes. So whether or not this succeeded or failed depends on whether it had specific outcomes at the beginning. To what extent do CPCs typically have these outcomes, and to what extent do they measure them, and can they tell whether they're succeeding or failing?
Right. And good questions, and they don't tend to measure them, and so we haven't really learned on that basis, which makes it an opportunity for you guys, right, to do more systematic measurement. I just want to go through. I have these 4 models or 5 models I want to talk about.
So the first model is the CDC model.
The first model is the CDC model and comprehensive community initiatives. The second model is a little different. We're moving to the 80s here. I'm sort of introducing these chronologically. And this is a model that is much more people-focused and where the intervention is a human capital type of intervention, so it's the community part of community development. And this one, I just think this is such an interesting example because it's not just people, it's people in a place. So the Philadelphia Mural Arts Program has painted 3,000 murals since it started almost 30 years ago. 1,500 kids per year paint murals. There's some idea about the outcomes for the people and for the neighborhoods. It seems like the neighborhoods where this mural painting is taking place are experiencing higher levels of civic participation. They tend to become more diverse. Racially and ethnically diverse. They also experience some property value increases in the neighborhood. And the organizers of this program, which is funded in part by the city, also by foundations, have moved into working mostly with ex-prisoners, ex-felons. They have a restorative justice project. And they've measured outcomes in terms of confidence building, self-esteem building, and lower recidivism rates, which is the big one. So this is a model of community development. Again, it's been scaled up, at least in Philadelphia. It's been sustainable over time, from what we can tell, again, this is the data is not as good as it should be, but it seems to have very positive benefits for both people and the neighborhoods. Okay, we're moving here to an entirely people-based model. This is a job training model, and it happens to be in the South Bronx. But it doesn't really relate to its place. Its market is regional. It draws trainees from around the region. It places them around the region. This is an extraordinary success story in upward mobility. It's been named among the 100 top social impact CBOs out there. It has done it by basically riding on the technology boom. So it figured out in the 1990s that the digital divide existed, and there was actually a niche opening up for low-skill jobs in computer maintenance and repair, and it began training its participants in these jobs and placing them in employers who were on the board and who were very engaged in the training curriculum. So very strong links between the economy and the participants. And this was one of the first studies I did after my PhD, was following these graduates of this program over 3 or 4 years and finding just tremendous wage gains, like 40% wage gains. And
how long is the training?
The training is a 12-week training program.
Really short.
It's a short-term, training program, and then followed by an internship, which turns out to be the key piece, and then very often the employer hires them off of the internship. And since my study, Public-Private Ventures did a study and also found that this is an extremely high impact model, and so very effective. What happens is that you have the short-term job training, you get your internship, and it builds your labor market attachment. And because you're in information technology, there's sort of a ladder to go up. It's quite heartening. You can start out repairing computers and doing hardware, and then you move up to web design, and then you become a programmer, and you can take a series of courses at night, and it actually works very, very well for an upward mobility model. So, and there's a number of these initiatives in different sectors, in healthcare sector and some advanced manufacturing and other sectors. And so these are very, very effective models for people moving up, not a community structure per se. Okay, moving on to innovating a whole new set of solutions. Let's talk about the Bay Area in the 2000s and the rise of a sort of regional community-based effort. So the Great Communities Collaborative, have you all heard of it? The Great Communities Collaborative? Okay. An effort to preserve affordable housing around transit stations with the idea that we're building or planning 75 new transit stations in the Bay Area. Housing is at risk. We need on the ground, as we do station area plans, we need to get affordable housing into the plans. We need to have activity on the ground. So this is 3 regional nonprofits: the Urban Habitat, Transform, which used to be called the Transportation and Land Use Coalition, and Greenbelt Alliance. So sort of an environmental, transportation, and an equity group get together and form this collaborative, and then they work with site coordinators who go out and find community-based groups. So it's sort of a bottom-up organizing model. So find the locals who care about what's happening in the station areas, get them to organize, empower them, provide technical assistance, and so forth. And so you're doing community development, but you're doing it, you're starting from, well, you have a regional effort of capacity building with a bottom-up community effort and coordination and learning across all the different station areas. Now, as you can imagine, this is a model that's very exciting to foundations, and foundations have poured millions and millions of dollars into this initiative, most of which has gone to my students who go work for it. They have recently done an evaluation, and they have found that they have sort of changed the dialogue on the ground. They've changed the conversation on the ground. You now have regular talk about value capture. How can we do value capture around transit stations? You have awareness that there could be displacement with transit station development. You have the rise of a financing tool, a land banking tool called the Transit-Oriented Affordable Housing Fund, $50 million leveraged from MTC, then leveraging bank money to buy up housing, buy up land around transit stations and build affordable housing there. So you have all these things going on, and so this is sort of the new model of regional organizing that is, again, very exciting to foundations, and I think they are kind of onto something because there is this learning process that is enabled through this kind of networked organizing. So it's very exciting.
If you're a sort of a cabal, so to speak, of involved people that make it possible to link all these places together?
Yes, because you have these 3 regional nonprofits which coordinate with people at the individual sites, at the individual station areas. And so they figure out, what does this particular site need? Does it need assistance in a site feasibility plan? Or
A social infrastructure to start, and I mean social in the sense of people who can deal with each other, right?
Yeah,
You know,
you have there.
Whose transit stations are we talking here? Is this just BART or is this?
Well,
Caltrain,
it's BART and VTA and Caltrain and yeah, they're all fixed rail stations that they're working on. Now, one of the things here about this collaborative is that it's been working for 6 years and it has nothing on the ground. There's not been a single affordable housing unit built or preserved out of this effort. And so it is talk. It is really about talk. Now, it does have the finance tools. It has this transit-oriented affordable housing fund. Eventually, hopefully, one likes to think that they will build something. But right now, they recently approached me and said, can you please find some outcomes for us? So I have a couple students working desperately to come up with some outcomes for them. That's right. Yeah.
But they've got the 50 million, so they bought
Yeah.
some land.
They haven't bought it yet, but they will. It's been 5 years to just get that fund up and going, and now they've got to start to, and unfortunately they're starting to buy land right as the market's taking off, so.
I was gonna say they get 3 lots in Atherton for 50 million.
Yeah, right,
But
exactly,
more
like how many
generic
units?
I mean, it seems to me the problem that you're trying to overcome is that zoning makes it really hard to do this stuff. So you
Yeah.
have that Caltrans line that goes down the peninsula, and
Yeah.
all those communities have 1 acre minimum lot size requirements on the zoning. So, you
Yeah.
take the train, you get off at Palo Alto, and there's nothing around you. The local land use laws make it impossible to build.
Well, and for that
anything.
matter, in the city of San Francisco, you can't tear down the Victorians and replace
Yeah.
them with high-rise.
So,
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
without that, how do you?
The barriers are huge, and without getting around, that's right, the local land use issues, and without a body to do that, you have a ABAG, which is fairly powerless. And there's an attempt, so this became sort of the bones of the sustainable community strategies, the SB 375 planning process that is going on, and it's also leveraged a $5 million HUD grant or help to leverage it. But those tricky local land use issues remain. Yeah.
In those same sites, is there some systematic analysis of the, I will call it otherwise normal market response to transit-oriented development, that is in building non-affordable housing?
Yes. In general, yes. I mean, we've looked at that, and I'll show you a little bit of my work on that in a couple slides down. But yeah, there's a clear relationship between market rate housing and transit improvements. Yeah. Okay, so I just want to jump to Peru for a second, because I've been working on rural economic development issues in the most recent past in the Andes above Lima, and it really strikes me that there are some lessons here that we need to look at in this country. And this is a basin above Lima. It's what they call the last green valley outside in the south part of the Lima region, and there's a 50 to 75% poverty rates in these communities. And yet these folks in a place called San Andres de Tupicocha did an amazing thing. They built 9 reservoirs to collect water. They built 2 themselves as a community. And then people started hearing about it and coming to see it, and they gained legitimacy, and they gained access to higher levels of government, and they got more and more reservoirs funded. And so they're doing a lot more, they've been able to irrigate a lot more land, and they've been doing their own kind of economic development here. And what struck me, I just looked at this for the Inter-American Development Bank, which wanted to understand some lessons about economic development and territorial governance from these a set of Latin American cases, and I'm working on this with Annalise Axinian. And this particular case, what was striking about what made it happen was the types of learning that was going on and the types of networking with other regions. So it all happens because a local resident here is an engineering technician. He goes to another region of Peru and sees one of these, comes home, and tells his neighbors about it, and they raise the money to do it themselves, and then other communities start seeing it and they say, we want to build one too, and then it spreads, and suddenly they have 9 or 10 of these. So this type of storytelling going on, it seems to be the key to transforming these areas. Yeah. They collect rainwater. If without these you only have water for 3 months a year, but with these, if you collect, you have year round, and they're producing, you know, apples year round, and they just laughed when I said we get apples once a year in California. Okay, and in another part of the basin, they haven't been so successful. It's been the USAID and the development banks coming in and saying, you need to go into agro-industry, and they've built this plant, which is to process apples into apple vinegar. And they built the plant. They never taught the locals how to use it. They never taught the locals how to market. So that's the main problem, is they can't sell to any supermarkets. They haven't learned about the standards and the connections. And so this is like a classic development failure, right? Top-down failure. So, so we need to beware of these lessons still in this country. Okay, so those are 5 examples of community development interventions, and then and we see sort of components of all of these in City Heights, in what's going on in City Heights. There's a CDC that's very active. It's a more of a comprehensive effort. It's working on education and health efforts. There's some focus on, the focus is really on the people in the place, not the place itself. The neighborhood seems to be working as a it may be serving as sort of an immigrant transition neighborhood, and seems to be, at least I haven't been there honestly, so, but I can't say, but it seems to, what has been done, the interventions seem to have incorporated some of the best of what we've seen in terms of investing in place, catalytic real estate developments, also investing in people at the same time.
Before we get into City Heights, you showed us 5 different models of community development.
Yeah.
Are these representative of the field as a whole? Are some of these viewed as more successful models? Because it sounds like at least 2 and possibly 3 of those, it's not clear that there are any, you know, outcomes that can be linked to it. So what was the overview for? Well,
I think, so here's the deal with community development. There are no answers as of yet. And I think there's a lot of promising practices and best practices. And we know we know of different models that have worked in particular places. We've had a lot of difficulty kind of replicating them in other places, because places are very, very, very different. And there's a whole bunch of unique factors working in different places. So I can't say, you know, there is a silver bullet in community development, and I don't think anybody would say that. But what's interesting to see in the field is that there is a lot of learning. We didn't know when Robert Kennedy came to Bed-Stuy, we didn't realize this kind of the real estate leveraging process that would go on. And we've seen that in many, many different neighborhoods, that a community development investment, a bricks and mortar investment, can have a catalytic effect on the whole neighborhood. I don't think we understood that well, and we didn't understand, this rise in property values, and so the learning that's taking place. Notice I ended up talking about the great community collaboratives and this idea that a lot of these neighborhoods are now talking about value capture on the ground. You can't imagine them 30 years ago talking about value capture. So there's now this. Now we understand how these processes work, and so we're doing it much better. Well, we don't, that's the thing about innovations. We don't know that they work.
Well,
but
in Hong Kong, it does work.
It does work in other
exactly
examples, yeah.
Now, the thing in Hong Kong is property values are worth even more than they are in the Bay Area. So when the government sells land, they get a whole lot of money to do stuff. The thing it's government, it's not CDCs, it's You know, they sell the land, they don't sell, it's 99-year leases. And basically they do a present value calculation.
Yeah,
They say,
right.
is the value we're creating greater than all the stuff we want to put into this new development? And among the stuff is housing that people with average income can afford, so.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we're figuring it out. I mean, we just dismantled redevelopment in this state, right? And so this is actually a great opportunity to start thinking about those things, and there will be a lot of legislation, I think, that will work on this in the next few years. So, so it's not, and value capture is going to only work in some places and not others, and I think there's going to be a lot of learning and painful learning that's going to go on in the area. So, Mark.
I think, you know, if I were an urban historian and knew something,
Yeah.
what I would say is over 50-year periods, neighborhoods change.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily all go downhill.
Right.
So you might want to look at, historically, at the development of neighborhoods in various cities throughout the world
Yeah.
in the last 150 years.
Yeah.
And see if you can learn something about why they got better.
Yeah.
In other words,
Yeah.
people have been, you know, whoever, social innovation, you want to call it anything, things change.
Yeah.
Right? Why they changed, God knows. But they did change, and so you might, besides these examples, go look at things, and I don't know which ones to recommend, but places do get better. Find out why. Now, maybe they all go downhill. Everybody, you know, there's only one way for neighborhoods to go. I'm going, you know, empirically. But go find out. Is it, for example, that, you know, it gets so bad
Yeah.
that the government takes it over and does something, or is it, you know, does it get bombed out and they fix it? That's Europe is the best example, right? Had lots of, you know, neighborhood improvement because they got bombed out, all right?
So Martin, I want to take your question and tweak it a little bit to ask, there's some evidence that suggests that, you know, there's an ebb and flow in the macroeconomy takes place, but there aren't a lot of instances where the ranking changes, where you see trajectories
Yeah.
vary significantly from sort of the general area. Do you have any thoughts on how these models play into that, or whether they are likely to do that? And then the other question
Yeah.
I had was, you know, we talk a lot in this school about the different sectors, so public, private, nonprofit. These models have different mixes of those, it
Yeah.
seems.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about how you view all of those, the three sectors, and what they contribute to these sort of innovative changing efforts?
So the question about trajectories is really interesting, and I worked with one of your colleagues, Manuel Pastor, for a number of years thinking about this question, but on a regional level. We were looking at the issue of regional resilience. And what we did is we took a lot of regions. We all did this in separate studies. We did a number of different studies, but we looked at regions that had done really, really well and what their starting point was, and tried to figure out why some had done better than others. And I think that study needs to be done on the community level, and hasn't really been done to understand why certain neighborhoods have transformed more than others. But the storylines are, there are a lot of factors in it, and if you look at some of the work on this kind of pure transformation of a region or a community, there's very few that have gone from a downward trajectory, or maybe none at all, to a pure upward. Unless there are some serious mitigating factors, like a hyper-strong market, or a huge investment of public funds for some reason. You see, you don't see these, you know, this ability to what we call reverse path dependency. It's very, very hard to do. But what you do see is a lot of these places on the margin. and a lot of the more working class areas that are able to transform themselves in some way, whether it's because they have a community fabric in place, or the City Heights case, they're in a strong market, et cetera. So there are all kinds of trajectories, and I don't think we understand totally which neighborhoods are going to do best. But I think what we do know is we haven't really found the panacea for the worst off ones. I think we do pretty well at the ones on the margin. Okay. Private, yeah.
Can I follow up on what you're saying there, Karen? Because you mentioned BedfordStuyvesant. That's in Brooklyn, right?
Yes.
And there's other parts of Brooklyn that have changed dramatically.
Yeah.
They weren't as bad off as BedfordStuyvesant. But what happened in Park Slope and all that area? I'm thinking about trajectories of places that really went up.
Yeah.
Was that from the CDC, or was that from an explicit organizing effort, or
Park Slope?
was it just a market?
I would say that's a market case.
It's a broad area though. It's half of Brooklyn now has been gentrified.
Yeah.
Maybe? Wow.
Yes, easily. Yeah. Well.
I guess I come from the other hand.
I was just curious how that relates to what might have happened in BedfordStuyvesant.
Well, yeah. Park Slope had proximity on its hand and transit. I mean, it's really benefited from being so close to Manhattan, and so it was quicker to go, and so you see that. But I think it's market forces. I mean, there were CDCs in Park Slope too, but market forces really took over.
So actually, maybe you could talk a little bit about the different role of nonprofits in places like New York, which are upward trending cities and becoming more expensive, and to a certain extent, CDCs are fighting against the market, trying to keep property values low or trying to keep housing affordable when everything is going up, versus in a declining market like Detroit or Cleveland where everything's falling apart, and the idea is that you want to try to prop something up when the market's not there.
So, yeah, it's a it's a completely different challenge.
And have CDCs been more successful in one of those models than the other, or do we not know? Raphael looks like he wants to answer that.
I mean, I have a view, but
You have.
you should answer first.
Well, I think, I don't know, like in terms of the numbers of housing units built in the different areas, but the CDCs, the ones that are in these strong market areas seem to have survived and expanded and changed what they did quite a bit. So,
Survival of the organization, that's not changing the outcomes. Right. But you have, for instance, we were talking earlier about the nonprofit housers in the Bay Area who. So their neighborhood, now it's too expensive for them to buy land in San Francisco. So what are they doing? They're working regionally, and they found other ways to preserve affordable housing in different parts of the region. So they've survived and thrived in that way. They have tended to be more soul focused, whereas I think the ones in Cleveland and Detroit have kept this kind of comprehensive approach, because the idea is you need to work more broadly in order to be successful. But Raphael wanted to say something.
I think it's really hard for CDCs. In both instances, their scale relative to the forces that are at play are just massive, and that's a challenge. And in the growing places, I do think that the metric moves, so that even in the instances where they are successful, that can trigger a bunch of changes in neighborhoods that make it difficult for them to continue to operate there. So they have to then do other things and become other things, and that transition is quite difficult. And the declining cities, if you know of a CDC that has turned around a declining city,
Yeah.
call me, because
Right.
So then that goes back
Yeah.
to your point about the three sectors. If nonprofits, if CDCs are really small scale relative to the city or the region, and the overall forces are at that level,
Yeah.
then why do we expect nonprofits to be fixing this as opposed to a public sector strategy that uses the government powers of taxation or trying to harness things like the private market? I mean, why do we expect CDCs to fix the world?
So,
Just asking.
no, I think that's a really key question, and it has to do with the rise of nonprofit governance and neoliberalization, and that in some ways we have when we sort of outsourced our government, started doing it 30 years ago. It's one thing to think about human and social services and to think about efficiencies and how maybe nonprofits can do things more efficiently, and maybe they will collaborate with private folks and make it happen. But it's another thing to think about communities and real estate. And so we sort of asked the nonprofits, you have great nonprofits that have taken over social services. You have United Way and other types of, a lot of different types of providers that have stepped in different ways. You don't see that kind of capacity in the community development field, and that's because it's a much trickier thing, because you have to deal much more with markets. You're not just dealing with people, you're dealing with people and markets. And so finding the ways to build those collaborations between the nonprofits and the private sector in the field of community development and real estate has been really, really tough. Yeah.
You said something about communities helping themselves. And I think that's
Yeah.
the illusion, that somehow there's an organization that's going to help them pull themselves up.
Yeah.
I bet, if you look carefully at all the real turnarounds, they were done by large-scale outsiders in some sense. My example that comes to mind, of course, is Paris under Haussmann, all right? You want to talk about, community, of course, it kicked everybody, poor people out. All right, but it's the perfect example. You want to fix up a slum, level it, right? And it's even better than that, because it's a fairly corrupt system, so that people bought land in the way.
Yeah.
So Martin, are you suggesting that successful economic development policy is knocked down on the poor neighborhood?
They don't need it.
No, I know what I'm saying is the following. If you find an example of any of this stuff, when I look at Silicon Valley, and I think of how Silicon Valley was supported by DARPA and a whole bunch of other federal initiatives, from the research fund, this is not done by the community. This is done because you have this massive federal impact.
Yeah, right.
And so I would be surprised if many of these so-called social innovations, they don't do it themselves. There's a big force involved, usually.
Yeah. Well,
And Paris may not be the best example, I'll admit, but it's my favorite.
Did you want to respond?
well, I would just say that, go back to Peru, and how are they going to scale up these reservoirs? And they're not going to do it themselves. They can't even finish building. They need a dozen more there. They can't even finish it themselves, but it's by exposing other people, bringing people in to learn about it, and now the federal government is like, oh my gosh, there's this whole system of collecting water, and let's invest in it and do it. So you need to scale. You have to attach yourself to a larger institution. You can't just be this isolated community building effort.
Yeah, so Karen, maybe the answer is in what you said before, which is we don't really know how to make it work.
Yeah.
And that's why government can't get involved. Otherwise, it just turns into a pork barrel game where Congressman X says, wipe out this neighborhood. And we don't know why we're doing it, we don't have a good strategy. So until we have some provable strategies, it's maybe not a good idea to have heavy artillery leveled on different communities. But let's go back though. I mean, we saw a paper that was circulated earlier before you came about social innovation, and you had some broader definitions there. And when I'm hearing your examples here, which are these examples are really either fixing up the place so it looks better, i.e. stamping out the appearances of poverty or the appearances of rundown housing, and the mural example is the best case of that, or helping the people with skills so they can get the hell out. So there's two extremes. Now, obviously, we'd like to have both of those go on. I actually like to hear you talk more about the mural project. I think that one might be the most cost-effective strategy. It wasn't pretending to be economic good, but it was building something. And it was something different than a measurable job increase or affordable housing increase. Didn't pretend that. But it did something.
But it's still transformative.
So tell us more about it. Maybe that's the cost-effective way to go.
Well,
pretend the other thing.
Well, I think to the extent, the lesson there is that to the extent that you can link people in place. I mean, this goes back to Herodotus, 3rd century BC. A city is people, not a place, but people in the place. And so that focus, the focus there, again, is not on revitalizing the neighborhoods and property values. That's incidental. And so it's not on building housing, and it's on this local, building people's capacity to participate in the arts and participate in civic endeavors. It's building social capital, yeah. Let me just go on, because I know, how much time do I have left, do you know? 25 minutes? Oh, okay. Because I haven't even started talking about innovation, so we need to get to innovation before I leave. So, you all are raising that there are issues of scale and sustainability with all these kinds of best practices in community development. And so I set out, it just so happens that I set out with the NEAKC Foundation to think about scale and sustainability in another arena, and it's the job creation arena, that we decided to fund a contest for ideas on job creation. And our main criteria was, first of all, that this should be job creation for disadvantaged communities. So that's very different from what a lot of other people are, there's a lot of organizations and think tanks working on job creation, but our niche was disadvantaged communities, and we wanted our ideas to be scalable and sustainable. And it turned out that that was a very, very, very high bar to set, and we got a bunch of people applied. We got about 50 applicants in our first round. They had ideas. We turned down economists right and left that weren't meeting one of our criteria. And in the end, I had major issues with whether a lot of the ideas we got were scalable and sustainable. For instance, we had a paper, great paper by Susan Christopherson on manufacturing sector. Scalable, sustainable, there's a lot of global factors there involved. But there were a few that I think were standouts, and these were all models that leveraged what was going on in their places, in existing institutions in the places, in existing policies. And there you could start to see where a little tweak of a program could have a major impact. So one example was in micro enterprise. So we had CFED, the Corporation for Enterprise Development, wrote a paper for us on how we might use Schedule C preparation as a way of starting to interact with millions of startups and micro enterprises that were not that didn't yet know how to run a business. So we could actually do some business assistance aligned with Schedule C preparation. They all have to do their Schedule C. So this is an opportunity for intervention. And then we had an Aspen Institute do a follow-up paper for us, which looked at job creation among micro enterprises, and they kind of sorted out which were the ones that were actually able to produce more jobs. And the numbers are very, very large. Now, of course, with micro enterprise, of course, the failure rates are very high too, but still we could reach scale, and through the tax code we had sustainability. Another example was in energy efficiency and what is called in the jargon the MUSH sector, municipal, utilities, schools, and hospitals sector. So the idea is, this was a paper by Cowes, Joel Rogers group at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and they pointed out that we'd taken on the most complex problem when we talked about energy efficiency. We took on residential, and why not take on the low-hanging fruit, which is these institutional structures which are owned by governments or by universities. So it makes it much simpler. If you could only get a city government to audit its energy usage, and then there's already these ESCOs in place that could serve as the funding mechanism, and you could actually generate a lot more jobs there than doing these very, very complex residential. Energy efficiency retrofit jobs. So fixing the light bulbs and the roofs and the insulation and all these municipal.
And did the people who the jobs were supposed to be created for already have the skills to do this, or did they then have to be trained in order to carry on the work? There's a whole literature on that. Yes, you probably would have to do some job training. You could probably do it pretty efficiently. Actually, in most of these cases, we have so many unemployed construction workers that you wouldn't even have to do training. At this point in the economy, you have this kind of advantage. So the idea behind the energy efficiency is if you can convince the public institutions that they need to retrofit their buildings, then they will go out and hire people to do this. So it's basically persuading somebody.
Well, a politician to take the leadership to do it. The funding structure is in place. You have these intermediaries that loan for this purpose, so you can leverage that. A lot of the institutional structure is ready already. So I mean, then that's the scalability and the.
And are these supposed to be? Say you've got lots of unemployed construction workers who know how to do this, and you can persuade politicians that they should create these jobs, and there's funding there. What's the mechanism? Or is there supposed to be a new company that's created that serves these purposes? Because these presumably still have to go through government contracting. Or is there a contracting firm there already that just needs to get that contract? Like, I'm sort of missing how this is creating a new type of employment.
Well, they're doing the retrofitting, and that wouldn't have taken place otherwise. There's job loss, but it's in the fossil fuels, so these are net new jobs. Yeah.
It's going on in LA Tech, right? Jenny, it's going on right a couple blocks away at LA Tech. They're training these people for these very same kind of jobs.
So what I'm trying to get at is how much of this is coming up with a new financing stream rather than diverting a financing stream that's already being spent elsewhere? Is this creating new companies, creating new jobs? Is this a job training issue? Are those all basically the same thing?
Well, you're still having to bond to get the money to finance this. But the institutional mechanisms to issue the bonds, et cetera, everything is already in place. It's just the willingness to bond for it. And the payback is there through energy efficiency.
Right.
So, but somehow we haven't gotten, facilities managers to think about this strategically.
And there are public incentives as well from the Department of Energy.
Yeah. Another example is anchor institutions, and talk about low-hanging fruit. It's the captive hospitals and universities, and they're purchasing this there. And so this is what the Democracy Collaborative in Cleveland has been working on, and Ted Howard has kind of gone around the country preaching this. gospel, and he wrote this paper for us. But the Cleveland and Detroit examples are really quite convincing of hospitals retooling their purchasing plans towards local businesses. And much of it in healthcare is actually net new because there are all these new market issues in healthcare. So for instance, digitizing of medical records is a huge growth area that we're going to go through in the next 10 years. And so positioning local startups to jump on that is an opportunity. And then we had a paper on employment social enterprise, which is by the Roberts Enterprise Development Foundation, which looked at federal procurement policies and how they've managed they've been working with social enterprises to hire disabled individuals. Again, what's common here is that we're leveraging things that we're doing already, programs that exist already, government structures that exist already, and so we instantly get scale and sustainability. And it's sort of the elephant in the room that we don't like to think about. Healthcare reform is not very sexy. Brookings wants to talk about export, driven growth for metropolitan regions. But the truth is the healthcare growth is going to be much greater, and there's all these institutions in place that we can leverage to take advantage of that. Yeah.
So how is financing things through bonds sustainable?
Well, if it's energy efficiency, the argument there is that it pays itself back. I mean, this is an investment that really pays for itself in very short term, as long as electricity rates go up.
I'm just wondering how any of these things would be sustainable. They'll just keep changing light bulbs?
Oh, energy. Yeah, I've wondered about that too with energy efficiency. Like, at what point maybe we retrofit everything and then we don't have anything left to do. But as it turns out, there is so much built stock to retrofit. It's a full-time employment plan for a few hundred years. Yeah. Okay, so sustainability, what do you want for your sustainability? Do we have to think out into infinite time, or can we, if we're just thinking in terms of...
You're thinking in terms of a task.
Yeah, right. That is a task to be done, yes. A task will eventually come to an end. And probably technology will change and we'll all be underwater anyway, so... Okay, so I think we should talk about innovation a little bit and what social innovation is, and what it could be. And here I don't think the field has gone very far in this area. So you guys saw a paper I wrote. I almost didn't want it to be circulated, but you wanted something I'd written on social innovation, and there was something that I wrote on social innovation, and actually the circumstances were kind of amusing. The OECD called me up and said, will you take 30 Europeans around Silicon Valley to look at social innovation? And it was the first time I'd heard the term. It was 2002, and I took them around to see a bunch of very amazing nonprofits, many of which have since gone out of business. Because a lot of it was an artifact of the boom, the dot-com boom, and a lot of money around the valley at that time. And the Europeans were very disappointed too, because they saw that a lot of what the nonprofits were doing were what they considered to be functions of the welfare state. So they were like, this is no big deal, but we'll enjoy the wine while we're here. But it made me think, the fun part for me was going around talking to a number of different venture capitalists who were investing in social innovation initiatives, and to see that kind of, to see what was piquing their interest, and to see kind of how these innovations, what Silicon Valley was doing in terms of risk taking, and trying to jump into new areas to think about how that was playing out in the social sphere as some of those same actors were beginning to act on social issues. So it was an interesting experience. And so this is the definition I put forth in the paper, that social innovation is about combining methods, ideas, or institutions in unique ways to create new solutions to social or economic problems. And I think it's an okay starting point. I went on from there to look at what others were saying about this, and I found, this was 5 or 6 years ago, it was after I wrote that paper, I started reading this literature on nonprofit governance, and I found this huge, rich world that I didn't know about, and you guys are going to have some of those folks come visit you and talk to you, and some of them are here on your own faculty, and this is one of the strengths of this school. So, so reading that literature was very instructive, but as I mentioned already, what struck me was a couple things where it fell short, where this literature fell short. First of all, that its focus was on human services and social services and delivery and efficiencies, and not so much on communities and places, and thus, because of that, not very oriented to markets and the private sector and the types of things that planners have to deal with all the time. And it wasn't, at least at that time, and I haven't kept up with it so much, it wasn't very focused on innovation. So I thought about this and thought, well, where is the literature on innovation? And it actually turns out to be in the regional economic development literature. And I think there's some really important lessons. And I think my personal view is that the way this field of social innovation can grow is to go back to some of this literature on innovation at the regional level and think about what we can pull from it to strengthen the field of social innovation. And so I just pulled out 3 or 4 main ideas from this literature, and a lot of these are in the nonprofit governance literature, but it's not explicitly about economic development and socioeconomic problems. So I think it might be useful. One is the idea about variety and diversity. This is an idea that comes from Alfred Marshall. We're talking the 1880s. The idea that he wrote, even in the same place, no two persons pursuing the same aims will adopt exactly the same routes. The tendency to variation is a chief cause of progress. And this then becomes the whole basis of urbanization economies, and then we have Jane Jacobs writing about diversity and so forth. But what's interesting here is it's in the nonprofit sector, there's a lesson here in terms of how nonprofits cross traditional boundaries to help solve problems. So doing better, more effective cross-fertilizations between market and government and nonprofit in this area.
Is social innovation generally understood to refer to nonprofits?
In my experience, it is, but others may have different views. Any ideas here?
A lot of it's business.
Well, a lot of the, so Stanford Business School has work on social innovation now, but it's a nonprofit. The idea is empowering nonprofits, or double bottom line.
It's businesses that have a social mission. So it's not
Corporate social responsibility, or, yeah.
And the social impact bonds are sometimes being floated by public agencies and being managed
Yeah.
by the private financial institutions. So it doesn't have to be.
Right, it doesn't have to be, no. Yes, this is my particular perspective coming from community development, which is nonprofit dominated. The second idea that's really important, I think, is about networks of practice and the importance of tacit knowledge, and the idea that new ideas spread through communities of practice, and this idea that facilitating this process of continuous learning is what makes it possible for regions to innovate. So in social innovation, it's much more about process innovation than product innovation. So we're thinking about innovations that are dynamic rather than static. And I think this is a really important idea. And when you think about like these models of community development, it's worthwhile to go back and think about which are the ones that are best able to kind of innovate continuously, and what is the role of learning in helping them move on. The third thing in regional development, which is really important, is the role of the venture capitalists. It's sort of the venture capitalists who plays sort of a broker role. And here's where the foundation is sort of the analogy. The foundation is the venture capitalists here. So in a regional economic development system, the venture capitalist plays a really important role by helping to pass information, helping to having high tolerance for failure, being willing to invest in risk, and also insisting on outcomes in some form. And so foundations have a lot to learn, I think, from the way venture capitalists look at what they're getting back on their investments. Okay, so and then the final piece is space, and I think this issue of the region is really, really important, and you don't really see much talk about it in the community development literature. Really, since Manuel Pastor, he's really been the only one. He wrote a book, right, on regions at work, and he coined the term community-based regionalism. And it seems really important to me, just as we've sort of thought about, or in regional economic development, we think about regions as being spaces for learning, that we think about how communities and community-based initiatives can benefit from their region and learn from each other in the region, just as the Great Communities Collaborative is doing. And I think we don't see this in enough comprehensive community initiatives, which also don't even really tend to think about the regional economy and what are the advantages in the regional economy and the sectors that are growing and so forth, and how they can take advantage of that. Yeah.
As you're talking about this, I'm thinking about a kind of nonprofit institution that you have maybe it's better called quasi-governmental institution, which are business improvement districts. And not all of them work, but some of them really have. And what they do, in a sense, is internalize some of the externalities you're talking about. The knowledge spillovers, the commercial traffic spillovers. So you have, here in Southern California, where I live, Pasadena, you had a blighted area, Old Town, that has been a remarkable success in redevelopment, although all the poor people have been kicked out of it, so from David's standpoint, there's still an issue. But it's a place that I think in 30 years, but it's a place 30 years ago you call it blighted, and now it's not. And a lot of it is the merchants have agreed to tax each other and have certain rules of operation that have allowed it to get some of these spillover benefits that you're talking about. I mean, you thought about these as...
These are great models, and the bids actually have they have a learning system in place. They learn from each other in a very effective way. So, yeah, and we don't have enough of that in community development.
And it's fairly new, but the one on the Anacostia River in Washington has done. I mean, what's happened there is kind of amazing. Now there it may be Martin's. Which Martin?
He's left. Yeah.
They built a baseball park down there, so maybe it was also a big investment that mattered too, but still.
Bids do tend to have public investment as well as their own internal investment. They tend to go to Broadway, 3rd Street, Old Pasadena. You can look at almost all of them. There is some sort of catalytic economic development funding from the state that then the bid tends to maintain. And they're very good at sustaining and maintaining success, depending upon how you measure success.
Yeah, so just to think about all the different models we talked about before, and to think about it in terms of whether they are sort of embedded in a process of continuous learning. I think there's sort of mixed results here, and there's really a question. I would question whether any of these will be around in 30 years, or at least in the same form, because they're missing a lot of these ingredients, this idea of variation, the networks of with other organizations and so forth. And in some ways, BedStuy is a legacy of the model cities, and we don't have that kind of institutional investment and program investment anymore to survive. So the CDCs tend to survive on their reputation. There's a question of whether we can launch a new generation of CDCs, or whether the City Heights CDC is sustainable, without the price charities, I think is a big question. And so then the issue is, what do you think, what are the big existing institutions that can help carry these things forward? What are the kind of big picture changes, like the healthcare reform that I was talking about, or the anchor institutions, or the other types of things we can leverage better to ensure the sustainability? And some of these will survive just because of good leadership, and there's a whole literature on that in the nonprofit literature, but that's not going to be enough over the long term to keep them sustainable. So just one word about impact, and then I'll wrap up. Where are we? Yeah, 2 minutes. Oh, perfect. Okay, so so I think it's again important to think about impact, but I think it's important to think about impact in creative ways. And there is a danger, if you kind of take a venture capitalist approach to evaluating these initiatives, that you're going to be doing a lot of bean counting and not looking at what matters. So this is, when I started thinking about innovation, I decided to found a center called the Center for Community Innovation, which is really trying to bring academic work to communities and vice versa, trying to get a better understanding of what we know in the ivory tower down to the neighborhoods. And so I started working with the Great Communities Collaborative, and one of the things I worked on a lot was gentrification, and I continue to work on this on an almost weekly basis. I have a community that wants me to come talk to them about gentrification. One of the things I did when I started thinking about gentrification, one of the first things I did was started to think about what's the big picture of neighborhood change. And because I was being told by people on the ground that the whole area was gentrifying, all of the Bay Area, it's all gone. And actually, if you kind of look at it by a strict definition, the gentrification's in magenta color, it's really just confined to a few neighborhoods. And really what's going on, well, the purple is neighborhoods that are going bipolar, so they have a lot of rich people coming in or changing the demographics, and a lot of poor people too. And then actually the predominant form of neighborhood change is actually neighborhoods just getting poorer. Those are the ones in yellow. So I go to community groups and I show them this, and this is a shocker to them. They didn't realize, they thought their neighborhood was gentrifying because somebody's rent went up next door, but it turns out that that they are actually going through a different type of process. So one of the things that about impact is this ability to kind of to transfer knowledge from the ivory tower and to sort of see the language changing on the ground. And I can't say that I've changed the language on gentrification in the area, but to at least kind of start the conversation is really, really important. So this is what, the Perscolas people told me years ago, is we needed to start the conversation, because if you don't start it, nothing will happen. So I think it's this process of learning that is so very exciting, and that's what's going to keep this social innovation field growing. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.